Hey everyone, my name is Alyssa Robinson, and today I'll be teaching you Lesson 5110, Managing Risk in Decision Making from the Defense Financial Management course. On to our learning objectives. First, we will clearly define risk, risk analysis, and risk management. Second, we will evaluate both various risk factors, both financial and operational, and how they impact mission-critical decisions. And finally, you'll learn how to assess and categorize risk objectively using the standard risk assessment matrix. Hopefully, by the end of this hour, you'll have a practical framework to approach uncertain situations systematically. Our goal is to take risk, which can be inherently more subjective, and make it as an objective process. So what is risk? Mathematically, risk is our likelihood, otherwise known as probability, versus our consequence or our impact. Definitionally, risk is the probability and consequence of an event causing harm to a thing that is valued. In the Department of War, we use a formalized framework. Specifically, we use Military Standard 882 ECHO, and this is the standard practice for system safety, and it lays out how we do risk. That said, I will note that the risk assessment matrix that we will use here will be used for the purposes of this course, but we are given levity. If your risk assessment matrix in your own organization looks slightly different from this one, that is okay to do that. And we have been given levity by the Department of War to use the exact risk to have some flexibility in our risk assessment matrix, our risk matrix format. Now let's break down risk. So to start with, we have frequent, so it is almost certain to happen regularly. B is probable, quite likely to occur. C is occasional, and this means it will happen sometimes. D is remote, and that means it's unlikely but possible. And E is improbable. It's highly unlikely, and you'd be surprised if it occurred. So next we have our consequence, and this is on the horizontal axis of our risk matrix. And this is the severity or impact if the risk eventually occurs. And the first one we have, a 1 represents catastrophic, and this represents mission failure, loss of life, or severe unrecoverable loss of critical assets. 2 is critical, so severe damage, major mission degradation, or significant financial loss. 3, we have marginal, minor mission degradation, or localized financial discrepancies that can be resolved with internal workarounds. And 4 is negligible, and that's just minimal impact on the mission or budget and easily absorbed. Now, there are some more very specific costs tied to each of these levels of risks. When it does get time for our exercise, you guys will have a sheet available to you in Canvas, and it will specify some of the more detailed numbers, the break on how these risks are categorized. All right, so what is risk analysis? Risk analysis is the active processing of assessing, communicating, and managing the consequences of potential unfavorable events. Risk analysis is a continuous loop. First, we assess the environment to identify what could go wrong and how bad it could be. Second, we communicate these findings transparently to commanders and stakeholders. Our commanders and stakeholders cannot make informed decisions if they are in the dark. And finally, we manage the risk by establishing controls, finding workarounds, and securing backup resources. It is important to remember risk analysis is not a one-time paperwork drill. I know some of our organizations standardize and require us to do it on a certain with a certain amount of regularity. But it should be an ongoing cycle that lasts throughout the entire life cycle of your project, program, or deployment. All right, so now we're actually going to take a minute and I'm going to pull up some risk examples for you so you guys can see how we will be doing risk categorization for the purposes of the Defense Financial Management course. All right, so here we have our risk examples. So to start with, I'll start with getting into a car accident. For me, I would say this is remote. And then, and it's pretty critical. Would not want this to happen. So since this risk is labeled 1, I'll just put a little 1 in this risk category, this little box here. Next, having your personal data stolen. So this is, I would say, improbable, but it would be catastrophic. Next, leaving the stove unattended and causing a kitchen fire. I would say this is improbable, but also catastrophic. Now, I want to say if you have two risks in the same box, you would just put a little comma and put a comma there and then put the other number inside the box as well. 4, experiencing a sudden AC breakdown in the middle of the summer. So I don't mind the heat very much. So for me, this is actually something that has happened occasionally in my experience and over the course of my life, but it's marginal. It's not too much of a problem. 5 is slipping and sustaining a physical injury when walking on wet pavement. I would say this is remote and critical. And then finally, missing a flight due to unexpected traffic. So that is also remote, but I'd say that's a marginal problem, depending on what you're traveling for. All right, so now we'll move back into our slides. And now we'll move on to risk management. So risk management, this is a decision-making process where we systematically identify risks and benefits, evaluate potential courses of action, and determine the best mitigation measures. It allows leadership to make calculated risk decisions. Risk management is fully integrated into our planning, budgeting, and execution, and it is ultimately a command responsibility. The commander owns the risk, but as financial managers, we are the key enablers, and we provide the financial data and impact analysis that allows commanders to choose the best path forward. So risk factors. So it is important when you consider risk that you don't just consider safety. A lot of times people mistake risk management as a safety-centric program where we try to minimize injury, death, or property damage, but risk is way more than that. We have, just to name a few here, cybersecurity risk, financial risk, which we're all tracking, project management risk, and even things like criminal or terroristic risk that all need to be considered. So on to our exercise. We are the financial managers for the 77th Fighter Squadron. Your squadron has been tasked to deploy 150 personnel and 12 aircraft to a non-DoD standard partner nation for Operational Desert Compass, a 45-day joint training exercise. The deployment is on a short timeline with personnel and equipment scheduled to depart in 30 days. Funding for the exercise will be provided to your major command via a specific project fund code, but the full amount has not yet been loaded into the financial system. Your role is to ensure financial readiness, mitigate potential funding shortfalls, and guarantee the responsible execution of the squadron's budget throughout the deployment. So here is your task that I'm going to give you. So please take the next 10 to 15 minutes and brainstorm at least 2 potential financial risks and 2 operational risks for Operation Desert Compass. You can find, and then also I would like you to use the risk assessment matrix in order to categorize these risks. I have provided 2 different documents in Canvas. One has the risk assessment matrix. I have provided 6 different places for potential risks. I'm only asking that you do 2, but if you think of others, then you can add up to 6. At least make sure you do at least 2 of the financial and 2 of the operational. And then I have also your other document will be an Excel workbook that has the risk assessment matrix in it for you to categorize your risks in. There's also in those documents that have the exercise, you can find the MIL standard from 882 ECHO that specifies exactly how the risk categories work and gives more specificity than what we went over during this lesson for you to use. All right, so I'm gonna everyone pause here and take some time, about 10 to 15 minutes to go and complete this exercise. All right, now that you have completed the exercise, we're going to go over what I had listed for my risks and we can categorize them. So the first 3 risks are financial that I have, and the second 3 are operational. So to start with, we have the full funding amount has not been loaded into the system, which could stall the procurement of critical services, equipment, and travel orders before the 30-day departure deadline. And I would say this to me is something that's likely, so I'd put it as probable, and it's pretty critical. So that would be right here. Second, I have operating in a non-DoD standard location, and that means most standard cost models may be inaccurate. Costs for local fueling, lodging, security, and transport are likely to exceed initial estimates. So this is, I put this as occasional, and then and critical. Next, I have the highly compressed 30-day timeline will force units to pay premium rates and expedited shipping fees to acquire necessary supplies and contractor support on time. So I think this one is probable, and I think for them to be there without their supplies and contractor support, it would be pretty catastrophic. So that one will be over there. Next, for our operational risks, rapidly deploying 150 personnel and 12 aircraft creates a high risk of supply chain bottlenecks, potentially delaying the arrival of spare parts or maintenance equipment and degrading aircraft readiness. I would say this is occasional, or this is actually occasional and then also critical. Next, a partner nation's non-standard location may lack reliable power, adequate runway conditions, or secure hangars, forcing mission delays or requiring expensive last-minute workarounds. So this one I would say is occasional and or we'll say this is remote but critical, or actually remote but catastrophic. And then 6 is operating outside of standard established DoD locations increases the risk of inadequate perimeter security, exposing both the 150 personnel and high value aircraft to local threats. So this is remote and also catastrophic. All right. Now we'll navigate back to the slides. So what we all just did is called risk characterization, and it is the process that allows us to assess our probability of achieving objectives and the severity of losses linked to an obstacle or action. We do this to systematically identify and assess impact to mission success. The key to this process is that it takes subjective, so such as anxiety, I'm really worried about our budget, and turns it into an objective, actionable data. This common language used in this process helps commanders prioritize resources and make rapid, defensible decisions. I want to note too, if you were watching me during that process when we listed the financial and operational risks, I am not a subject matter expert in deployments, or honestly, my background's not even necessarily is not as heavy in finance. And so if you looked at where I categorized certain things and thought, oh no, that was not right, you are probably right in that, because my subject matter expertise resides in other areas. And I think that's an important thing I want to note here is if you are categorizing risk or you are choosing someone to categorize risk, tasking someone with it, it is important that they have subject matter expertise in the area that they're going to be doing the risk characterization. Because if you are not familiar with the problem or with the scenario that you're categorizing risk for, you aren't going to be able to categorize the risk effectively or accurately. And that in a real world scenario is a problem. So just something to consider when you're doing risk, when you're characterizing risk or assigning someone else to characterize risk. So now let's move on to the 4 principles of operational risk management. So to start with, we have benefits outweigh cost. An example of this is the Department of War allows us to use YouTube for training. Is there some cybersecurity risk in that? Probably. Have they determined that the benefit of being able to use YouTube outweighs the risk of allowing us to have YouTube on our government computers? For us, those of us who organization does allow us that, they have determined that. So if you are for risk management, it's important to consider whether the benefits outweigh the cost. Second, no unnecessary risk. The example here is in the Department of War. Every year we take cybersecurity training, and in that training they tell you don't click on phishing emails. So they say don't even take the risk. If you see a suspicious email, you're not going to click on it. And we're actually they have trained that risk out of us so that we're not taking unnecessary risk. Next, we have anticipate and manage risk by planning. So an example of this is we all do fire drills and safety drills for active shooters. So we're trying to anticipate this potential risk and plan our mitigation of that risk prior to it occurring. Finally, risk decisions at correct levels. So first, I would say don't elevate minor risks to a high level, but even more importantly than that, a high level risk should not be evaluated and accepted by a junior employee. We are ultimately decision support as financial managers, and it is important that we elevate the risk. If there is significant risk, it is important that we elevate that to the correct level for our leadership to make that decision. And one last thing I'll say about that is don't be the employee who cried wolf. If you are briefing leadership, and I'll give an acquisition example here, but this can go for almost for many situations. But if you tell someone during a brief that you need funding, not for your program to be shut down and no longer be able to be fielded, and they take away that funding and your program continues on, leadership is not going to continue giving you that funding. In fact, they're probably going to take that funding away, and they may even take more to see how little funding you can operate off of. So if you categorize something as, a high risk, make sure it is truly a high risk. Just because something I find often as an FMer, or not even as an FMer, just as a DOW employee, it's easy to get really passionate about the parts of your programs that are important to you. And emotionally, it might seem quite high risk for you. But when you try to look at it objectively, it's not as a severe of risk as you're thinking. But that's all I'll say on that. Again, don't cry wolf, but also on the other far end of that, if you have a high level risk, please do send that up your chain of command. Don't accept that risk on yourself if you're, at a working level employee. So that's all I have for you guys for our managing risk and decision making. And let's go through the review. In our risk matrix, so in our In the likelihood, in risk assessment matrix, what does likelihood of rating A stand for? And that is frequent. In the context of risk management, what is the course of COA? I actually already said it, a course of action. And then according to the principles of operational risk management, when should you accept risk? And that would be when the benefit outweighs the cost. Finally, let's go through our summary. So we have the definition. We went through the definition of risk and risk analysis. And then we went through the definition of risk management. And then finally, the 4 principles of operational risk management. So that is all that I have for you today. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great one. Bye.